Okay, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This session is concerned with critical thinking tests, their strengths and weaknesses. Before I launch into a specific focus on particular critical thinking tests, though, I'd like to put my remarks into context. I would also like to call to your attention that we have perhaps the most distinguished author of critical thinking tests in the room checking to make sure that I do a good job. That's Robert Ennis from the formerly of the University of Illinois and the Cornell critical thinking test author and the Center for, what was the name of your center? Illinois Critical Thinking Project. So we are lucky to have him here as perhaps the most knowledgeable person in the country on critical thinking tests and on the technical requirements, the technical considerations that one needs to be aware of in constructing a critical thinking test. But before we get into particular tests, let's think in a broad way about the most embracing concept, the notion of assessment itself, the notion of evaluation, and see critical thinking tests in the context of the bigger picture. In the first part of this series, we focused on the logic of evaluation, the logic of assessment, and the emphasis was on the fact that we need to distinguish subjective preference from objective evaluation. And we touched upon the fact that all of us have our preferences. We all exercise and utilize those preferences to make decisions about food, about decorations, about where we live, about many other things, including the personality types we like around us, whether we like crowds or not crowds, or solitude or the seashore rather than the urban center, and so forth. Subjective preferences exist. They are very important in our lives. But we shouldn't confuse our exercising of a subjective choice with the conducting of an objective evaluation. And by objective, I simply mean that there are occasions where we want to estimate, judge, or determine the significance, value, merit, or worth of some person, event, thing, relationship, action. In other words, one of the things we are, and one of the most important things we are as humans, is we evaluate. And when we evaluate, when we engage in this task called evaluation or assessment, the very logic of what we're doing imposes constraints upon us. One is not free to evaluate in any way that one wants, precisely because, for example, one is not free to confuse a preference with an evaluative judgment. In evaluation, one has a purpose. And we can always look at the evaluative process with this question in mind. Is the purpose a legitimate purpose? Is it a significant purpose for which we're evaluating? Is it a clearly stated purpose that underlies our evaluation? If we're evaluating, there must be something that we're evaluating, and we have the responsibility to collect relevant facts about the thing to be evaluated, person, object, whatever. And these facts must be correlated with appropriate standards that are in line with our purpose and can be applied given our facts. We have the responsibility to come to conclusions which are warranted by the facts and to use good reasoning in going from fact to evaluative conclusions. We have the responsibility to look at the assumptions we're making when we engage in thinking in this area, because you can't think without making assumptions. And when you're evaluating, you are thinking, therefore you're making evaluative assumptions, and you need to look at it. And we need to look at the implications and consequences of how we evaluate, what we evaluate, and with what purposes. Because all thinking has implications. When you act upon thinking, it has consequences. And being sensitive to what those implications and consequences are is all part of evaluation. So there's a broader picture here that we need to remember, that evaluation is an intrinsic and significant part of human life. If we're good evaluators, the quality of our life is much higher than if we're poor evaluators. We evaluate relationships, we evaluate parents, we evaluate political parties, we evaluate policies, we evaluate books, we evaluate religions, we evaluate philosophies, we evaluate ourselves. We evaluate different dimensions of ourselves. We evaluate our emotions, our thinking, our behavior. So evaluation is an intrinsic and significant part of life, and to be a good critical thinker is to be a good evaluator. It is to take command of your evaluations and to use them effectively in thinking through whatever you take seriously as worthy of thinking through. So if we put these broader notions in the background and then we look at critical thinking tests, we could take any test and ask, what is the purpose for which this test was constructed? What are the kinds of questions that it raises? How is it collecting or arranging itself so that data is emerging? Under what conditions are these data being collected? What sorts of conclusions are we coming to as evaluators, and what standards are we using, and so forth and so on. Now, we are not going to have the time, nor do I think, for our purposes, the appropriate exercise is to take any one test and give it a rigorous critique. To do so would require a lot of technical considerations, and I probably wouldn't be the best person to conduct the assessment of these tests at that level. That is not where my training is. But at a broader level, I think all of us have to assess tests, including critical thinking tests, and we have to ask ourselves questions appropriate to the process we're engaged in. Are we fundamentally concerned, for example, when we test students, to improve their thinking? Or are we fundamentally concerned to be accountable to some external agency that wants to know at what level are they thinking on some standard mode of testing that can compare them to students in other states or in other countries, or that sort of thing? And very often, I think, these purposes are contradictory. Very often, to engage in the kinds of testing which gives results that maybe are plausible for international comparisons may not give us the kind of feedback we really need in order to improve our instruction or to improve the thinking of the students. Now, I say very often, and I mean just that, very often. I don't mean always and necessarily. And I think, for example, that the most important form of critical thinking testing and assessment is something that should be going on each and every day in the classroom. For example, and a lot of this is very informal, but the fact that it's informal doesn't mean it can't be objective, important, and extremely useful. I do things like this in the classroom. I will have students write papers, and they bring those papers in, and then we'll review the criteria. What was the purpose for which we wrote this paper? What are we looking for? And we'll put the criteria on the board. And I may model walking through one paper, read it aloud to the class, and dialogue with them about how to assess the paper for clarity, for accuracy, for coherence, and then put the students into groups of 3s or 4s and pass out the papers and have them evaluate the papers using the criteria and following the model. Now, while they're doing that, I would wander through the class listening in on how they're doing this. And in this listening in process, I get more information about the level of their critical thinking, I think, than perhaps, maybe this is an exaggeration, any data on an objective machine-scored test. I notice many things about their thinking, many weaknesses in their thinking, and I'm also in a position right on the spot to decide where I'm going to make my next move in trying to move them along. So in one walk around that lasts maybe 20 or 25 minutes, I think I get a very good sense of the level of critical thinking that is going on by these students engaged in the assessment process. And I think this is the area where ultimately we want to move the action. We want teachers who are able to give, as it were, immediate feedback to students about the level of their thinking, but we don't want, for one thing, because it's not practical, and for another reason, because it is not effective, for them to just be standing there and giving Jack his feedback and giving Jill her feedback and giving Dee her feedback and so forth. It's not practical and useful. We want them to be giving feedback to each other, and we want to be monitoring, observing, analyzing, and coming to evaluative conclusions of the form: at what level are they thinking? What moves in thinking do they need to make that they're not making? What are their weaknesses? And which of those weaknesses does it make sense to begin to talk to them about? And how shall we do this? How shall we move from where we are to the next step along the way? And so this, it seems to me, is bona fide assessment. It's very objective. You get information that is accurate and valuable. So, for example, you might be listening to a group of students whose main mode of responding to a paper is highly subjective. I liked it. I thought it was very interesting. Another student saying, I didn't like it. I didn't think it was interesting at all. Not using any terms having to do with the criteria. In which case you might stop the discussion and you say, I'm hearing you say a lot of remarks like this and this and this. These are remarks about your subjective reaction to the paper. This is not the kind of remark we want. We want remarks like this, which help the person see what to change in their paper and how to improve the quality of their writing and their thinking. So you make that move right there, and then do a little explanation, a little more modeling, and then you continue, and lo and behold, they're less subjective and they're making more comments of the sort which are appropriate. So you can do an evaluation, gather good data, and modify your teaching performance right on the spot based on that evaluation process. And to me, that's going to be more valuable than any test that you might give and then come back with a score and say, okay, but what should I do tomorrow, given that score?